Good afternoon and welcome to English 13. In this hopefully short lecture, we'll be discussing Zachary Shore's Grad School Essentials. Grad School Essentials by Zachary Shore is conceived to be a kind of crash course in scholarly skills. I gave you a copy of this book, which you can read on your own time. I highly suggest that you read it because I found it to be really helpful in honing the skills that you will need in conducting academic work, not only at the undergraduate level, but also at the graduate level. So anyway, this book has five main parts. The first part is how to read part one, which concerns dissecting a text. Dissecting a text, meaning whenever you read, what is a strategic way of distilling the information that you need from any given academic text. So the first part is on how to read, dissecting a text. Second part, how to read, critiquing a text. So this part is concerned with not only absorbing or distilling information from a text, but engaging with the content of a particular text or engaging with the arguments and reacting or responding to the arguments of an academic text. So if you remember, one of the things that characterizes academic writing is that it is driven by a question or an argument. So one of the things that you will be expected to do whenever you read something for academic purposes is that you not merely reproduce what the text is telling you, but you're also actively engaging the text or interrogating the arguments and the evidence provided by the text. So that's the second part, critiquing a text. The book also has a section on how to write, how to speak, how to act, and how to do research in academic settings. So for this lecture, we'll just be discussing how to read part one, how to read part two, how to write, and how to do research. All right, let's start. So the first part is how to read part one, dissecting a text. Now, the context of this section is that when you're writing academically, you have to read a lot in order to write anything at all, because as we have discussed before, academic writing is characterized by the way that it responds to previous knowledge. So when you write academically, you're not writing in a vacuum. You are not simply expressing your own opinion, or you are not simply expressing subjective perspectives on your research problem or question. Rather, academic writing is characterized by its referentiality, meaning you are always referencing previously available information, whether in order to agree with it, or in order to contest or to challenge it, or whether to use it as support for your own arguments and findings. So again, what characterizes academic writing, aside from the quality of being problem-driven or argument-driven, is that academic writing references other sources of information, other sources of knowledge and opinion and perspectives. So referentiality. Now, if you need to read a lot in order to write something, then you need to come up with a strategy for reading effectively or for reading strategically and efficiently. Because otherwise, you might end up spending all of your time reading and then not really knowing what to make of all the things that you've read. So, in this section of the book, Zachary Shore gives us a number of strategies or steps that you can do in order to read efficiently and effectively so that you save up your attention and time and energy and not spend all of your waking hours basically reading. So the first suggestion is that you have to read for the thesis. Whenever you encounter an academic text, usually that would be, preceded or that would be attended by an abstract. And usually the abstract presents or articulates the main argument of the text. So again, the thesis is the main idea or the main argument or the main answer of the paper to its central research problem or question. So when you read an academic article or an academic book, have this awareness that, okay, this is academic writing, it's driven by a problem, it's driven by a question, and it's driven by a thesis. So first you identify that, what is the main driving question of this essay or this book or this article, and then identify the main answer that the article presents. So that's the first thing that you do, identify the question and the answer or the thesis of the article. And why is that so important? Because presumably all of the information that is included in that text. All of the other arguments, all of the other supporting sources of information or evidence, they would all be there because they help the text or the article or the book support its thesis. So that's the first thing you look for, the thesis. And then with that thesis in mind, you will be better able to contextualize and frame and understand all the other information in the article. Because again, all the other information in the article is supposed to help the writer advance or support its thesis or main argument or main idea. Second, Zachary Shore presents this five-step method for reading actively in a strategically nonlinear fashion. So I highlighted or I emphasized the word actively here and nonlinear here. Why? First, because when you read, you are not just passively consuming or absorbing information. That is not what you're supposed to do when you're reading. When you're reading actively, meaning that while you're reading, you are also thinking about what you are reading and you are also organizing that information in your mental model of what this paper or article is about. And again, that mental model, so to say, is based on your understanding of the thesis of the work. So when you're reading actively, again, you are not passively consuming information, but you are at every turn engaging with, interrogating, organizing the information that you are reading. And the best way to read actively is to not read in a linear fashion. Parang linear meaning that you go from one word to the next, one sentence to the next, one section to the next. It helps to consider that most academic writing follows particular patterns or models. So usually your any academic paper would at least have three major parts. You have the introduction, you have the body of the paper, and then you have the conclusion. The introduction is where the author introduces the problem, talks about the context of the problem, talks about the usual ways by which this problem has been understood by other academics. That is the research context, what has been written about this topic. And in the introduction, that's also where the author would present his or her thesis or main argument. And then in the body of the paper, the author would probably discuss their findings and then the discussion of the findings. In the introduction also, that's all usually where authors discuss the methodology. Not all authors include a methodology section where they discuss precisely how they undertook the research, but if you're looking for methodology, usually that's also in the introduction. It depends on how long the paper or the book is. So again, in the body, that's where you discuss the main arguments and the main findings of the paper. And then in the conclusion, that's where you tie together all the previous points that you discussed. You restate them in order to emphasize the significance of the intellectual work that you have done. And in the conclusion, that's also where authors often state the implications of their research for succeeding research on the topic or for other researchers who might want to do further research about this topic. So again, usually an article, an academic article or an academic writing would have three major parts: introduction, body, and conclusion. So knowing that academic writing has these main structure, Zachary Shore presents this five-step guide to digesting or to, reading academic writing actively. So for him, the first thing that you do is you analyze the title and the subtitle of the work, because the title and the subtitle would tell you what the work is going to be about. So for example, one of the academic articles that are open on my Chrome window right now is titled "The Making of, quote, Made in China Feminism," unquote, by Angela Xiao Wu. So let's look at the title again. The title is "The Making of Made in China Feminism." So let's look at this title. Obviously, the main concept in this article would be "Made in China Feminism." So if you have a title like "The Making of Made in China Feminism," then you expect the article to be about feminism, but more particularly, the article will be discussing feminism with Chinese characteristics, so to say, or feminism as it is practiced in China, or feminism as it has developed in China. And actually, the interpretation that this article will be how feminism developed in China is more probable, because the first part of the title is "The Making of Made in China Feminism." So the making. So the article seems to indicate that this will take on a historical approach to the development of made in China feminism, because it has that word, the making of. So you expect a historical approach to discussing how feminism came to be made or came to develop in China. So that's the first thing that you do when you're looking at an article. You look at the title and the subtitle, if any, and doing that will already give you an idea about what the article is about. And that would also help you identify the main research question or problem and the main argument of the paper. After you look at the articles or the book's title and subtitle, then you can look at the table of contents or the headings and subheadings of the writing. So if you're looking at an academic book, you can look at the table of contents. If you're looking at a research article, you can look at the headings or subheadings. So you just need to browse, right? What are the main contents of this work? And having an idea of that, like just looking at the structure, the table of contents, or the outline, the main topic outline of the work would already give you an idea of what to expect from this work. So consider that the outline of any essay or any writing is the skeleton, so to speak, of the writing. So when you analyze the table of contents and the headings and subheadings, you will already be able to develop an idea of what are the things that this entire work talks about. How does the work proceed from point A to point B to point C? And if I'm particularly interested in a specific topic, which is the part of this work that I should pay the most careful attention to? So before planning to skim a work, you have to know exactly which parts you can kind of skim because you're not as interested in these topics or contents, and which part you should pay more careful attention to because maybe that's where you need more information to put in your own research paper. So scrutinizing the table of contents and the headings and subheadings would already give you a map or an overview of where this work is going and what is it going to be about. Next, the author, Zachary Shore, recommends that after you have looked at the title and then scrutinized the contents of the book, the table of contents, you can then like flip to the conclusion. The conclusion is where the author um, summarizes what he or she has said before and then drives home the main point of the intellectual endeavor. But most research papers do not, like in the process of summarizing what the author has tried to do um, throughout the paper, they would also explain the context of the problem, the kind of contribution that the writing is making, and then the arguments that they made in order to give that sort of contribution. So if you want to read like in an efficient way, if you don't have a lot of time to read the entire thing, the conclusion is one of the things that you should not skip at least, because this is where the author summarizes what has come before. So first you read the conclusion, and then you read the introduction to better develop your understanding of the problem and the significance of the work at hand. So again, analyze the title and subtitle, scrutinize the table of contents, read the conclusion, read the introduction, and then after reading these things, especially because in the introduction also that's usually where the author signposts or tells you explicitly how he or she will go about the discussion in the body of the paper. So the introduction also gives you an idea of how the author gets from point A to point B to point C. So once you have a general idea of the structure of the piece and the main ideas in the piece, then you can target the most important parts of the book or the article in the body of the book or the article. So when I say the most important parts, I mean the parts that are most relevant to your purpose for reading a particular work. So let's say you just want to look for a specific information about the history of land reform in the Philippines after the post-Marcos conversion of arable land into non-arable land. So let's say you're just looking for particular information about this specific period in history. Then you look up or you find an article about the history of land reform in the Philippines since the early 19th century. Once you have identified the section of the paper where the information that you are seeking may be found, then you don't need to read the entire thing. You can just go to that particular section and then read it carefully. Of course, if you need a more comprehensive understanding of that particular section, you can read the entire thing. But if you're but you also have to gauge, like, do I need to read the entire thing or do I just need this particular section for my research? But in order to make a judgment like that, kasi di ba judgment yun na, okay, I will just read section 6 on page 38 because that's where the information I need may be found. If you're gonna make that kind of judgment call, then you better know the general layout or the general map of the paper or the book. So again, in order to have that mental map of the writing, you need to have read at least the table of contents, the conclusion, and the introduction. And after doing that, then you can target specific parts of the body of the paper. So if you look at this process, it's a nonlinear process because you're not just reading from introduction to body to conclusion. Rather, you begin in the conclusion, then you read the introduction, and then you target specific sections of the body of the paper. So for Zachary Shore, that is the most efficient way of reading academic work. Instead of going from A to B to C, you go to C and then to A and then to B. Zachary Shore's next recommendation for reading actively is an exercise in paraphrasing the information that you are absorbing or consuming. So again, the role or the purpose of active reading is to make you not passive consumers of information. The purpose of active reading is to make you exercise your facility for thinking and not just passively absorbing information. So when we always talk about developing critical thinking, we always talk about developing independent thought, ganyan, but those things do not simply emerge without training. Active reading is training in critical thinking and independent thought. Again, you are not just passively consuming what is fed to you, but you're also interrogating it. and you're engaging with it and you're asking questions of it. So in order to develop that facility, Zachary Shore recommends that you restate and write down the thesis and the supporting arguments of the work that you're reading, including empirics and logic. So when I say empirics and logic, empirics refer to the tangible bits of evidence that we can assemble. So examples of empirical information in a work include statistics, interviews, legal or historical documents, journalistic or organizational reports, and existing research. These are empirical material, like data that you can actually reference, pieces of evidence that are used to justify a particular argument or position. The logic refers to the reasoning that you do in order to make sense of the facts. Like you cannot just assume that when you present the facts, they will automatically make sense to the reader. No, when you present facts, when you present data, you also have to do a bit of explanatory work in order to help the reader make sense of these facts, in order to help the reader frame and contextualize the information properly. So when you contextualize information, often you draw on particular theoretical perspectives. So for example, you're presenting data on rates of domestic violence in order to support the position of legalizing divorce. And then when you present all of this information on domestic violence, especially violence against women and children, when you present all of these statistics, you can draw on feminist perspectives that argue for say the autonomy of women in a patriarchal society as a way to lessen these instances of domestic violence. You can argue that marriage in the Philippines, let's say, remains to be a patriarchal institution that limits women's agency or something. So when you make an argument like that, you are drawing on feminist perspectives on marriage as a patriarchal institution that limits women's agency, especially those of women from the lower classes, let's say, who are entirely dependent on their husbands for material needs or for money, mga ganyan. So when you're presenting the data, you're not just, assuming that the reader will be able to understand the data the way that you intend them to, but you also have to, again, do some bit of explanatory work or explanation for making sense of the information. So that explanatory work is the logical part of your argumentation. So again, empirics relate to concrete bits of evidence that you can use in order to support your position. The logic part is when you um, explain the significance, the meaning of these bits of information that you are presenting to the reader. So when you're reading something, one good way to engage with what you are reading is to restate the main ideas and the main justificatory mechanisms used by the work. Justification, including empirics and logic. Another way of making sense of an academic piece of writing is asking yourself if the author isn't doing this yet, because usually the author would be answering this question for you, but you also ask questions like, okay, what is the point of reading this? Like, what is the larger implication of this seemingly very specific study? Kasi it might be that even though the paper or the book is not directly related to your topic, it might be that what it is saying can be connected to a broader area of study that may be relevant to your own research interest. So for example, some of you are working on the issue of food, and I think one of the students in that group wants to work on the issue of land reform, but the other members of the group might be working on more directly food related issues, let's say let's say like what I wrote here, a paper presenting a comparative analysis of the farm to market supply chains and business models of three vegetable delivery services operating in Metro Manila. Ganyan. So one of you might be working on agrarian reform and one of you might be working on business models and supply chains of food delivery services in Metro Manila. They seem to be, if you just look at the specific research topic, they seem to be barely connected at all. But when you find the links to something larger, let's say the something larger here is the significance of land ownership and the ownership of the means of production as well as the means of, you know, distribution, in order to help develop food security, then you will be able to find connections between your own topic, like land reform, and the seemingly disparate or different topic of the business models of food delivery services. If you find the larger connection of, the significance of the ownership of the means of production and distribution in developing food security. So papasok din dyan yung land reform because the question of who owns the land on which produce is cultivated is a salient concern with regard to the issue of food security. So when you read an academic work, even if it seems to be about a very niche topic, you can ask yourself, what is the broader significance of this essay? And sometimes you don't even need to figure out the answer for yourself. Like you just have to ask it because usually good academic writing would also explain the broader significance of the research done. So you ask yourself that and then you look for the answer in the text, because usually the text would also provide that. So in this section of the presentation, I also included tips for narrowing the scope of your particular study. This isn't from Shore per se. This is my own example, yung Good Food Community, Gising PH, and Future Fresh. These are gulay delivery services that I have tried here. So that's what I used as an example. But let's say that you're writing a paper, again, on a comparative analysis of the farm to market supply chains of three vegetable delivery services operating in Metro Manila during the pandemic in order to contribute to our understanding of food security, access, and sustainability. So let's say that the broader significance of an essay like this is, again, these big issues of food security, access, and sustainability. So the question then becomes, how do I discuss these very big concerns using a very narrow and specific case? Kasi when you're writing about something big, you always have to consider, okay, then how can I provide concrete information and concrete evidence-based arguments about the big things that I am writing about. So you have to limit the scope of your paper so that you can say something meaningful about the topic. So these are, I put here multiple ways for narrowing the scope of the study so that it's not just one big thing of food security or sustainability. They're very big and they're very abstract. So you have to bring them down to the level of concrete intervention. So one way of narrowing the scope of your study is narrowing the geographical focus of your study. So instead of looking at food security in the entire Philippines, which is very broad, you can just identify a particular city or particular area, in this case, Metro Manila. Or I remember during our last discussion, somebody brought up the question of how can I make my contribution to this course community is relevant to my own community, di ba? My local community. So you can limit the geographical scope of your study to your town in Cebu or in Samar or wherever else you might be embedded or whatever your location of concern is. So you can narrow the scope of your study by limiting the geographical scope. Another way of narrowing the scope of your study is limiting the temporal scope. So in the case of this problem, I put during the pandemic. So the services that I would be looking at must be operating at least since March 2020. Kasi I want to look specifically at the changes that were brought about by our transition to more, digitally mediated lifestyles because of the social distancing demands brought upon by the pandemic. So limit your geographical scope, limit your temporal scope, and these limits would help you curate or select very carefully what data you will be looking at in order to do your study. Because if you don't limit the geographical and temporal scope of your study clearly, you would end up reading all sorts of data. Tapos kalat-kalat na siya na coming from different time periods, coming from different geographical contexts. It's hard to make a clear and limited argument from data that has been gotten from any na lang, now wherever, whenever. So you limit the scope of your study so that you also limit the scope of your data collection. That also means that you will just be reading the most relevant resources to your study based on your temporal and geographical limits. So you're also guarding yourself against drowning in resources kasi you're just saying, okay, ito lang yung scope ng study ko, ito lang yung aaralin ko, and not anything beyond this. So one way of narrowing the scope of your study again is doing a geographical limit, implementing a temporal limit, and also identifying the objects of your study. Meaning, what is it specifically that I am looking at? What is it specifically that I am examining? Hindi pwedeng kunwari, capitalism lang. Because that's so broad and that manifests in various areas of life, that manifests in various objects, that manifests in various industries. So you have to identify very concretely what are my objects of study? What am I studying in order to support my argument? Objects of study include, for example, textual materials. Let's say I want to talk about the politics of political campaigns. I want to look at the formation of collective identities during the presidential campaigns for the 2022 elections. So if that is your area of study, if that is your topic, the formation of collective political identities during the 2022 electoral campaigns, then you have to consider, okay, in order to speak about this topic, the formation of collective identities, what are the objects that I will look at specifically? So maybe I would just look at viral videos on TikTok that were produced in support of particular candidates. So I'll just look at these and then I will collect, let's say, only TikTok videos that were produced in the Philippines from the March 2022 electoral campaign period to the end of April 2022, let's say. So you have a temporal and geographical limit. Tapos yung medium, yung field of inquiry mo is just, yung platform of choice mo is just TikTok. And then, of course, you'll have to justify that. But you're limiting the range, the temporal and geographical range of your study, and then clearly identifying your objects of analysis, TikTok videos. And then in doing that, and identifying your objects of study, you'll also have to explain why you chose TikTok videos as objects of study rather than, say, Facebook groups or Twitter hashtags. You'll also have to justify that. But the point is that you identify clearly your objects of study. So in the example that I put in the presentation, the objects of study here are three particular digitally mediated services and their business models and supply chains. So malinaw na first I have to figure out what is the business model, what is the supply chain, and there are various ways of doing that. You can maybe look at their business plan if that is publicly available. If it's not publicly available, maybe you can schedule an interview with the founders of these services in order to ask them about their business models and supply chains. And some of these services publicize their supply chains kasi they pride themselves on being social entrepreneurs, meaning that they are enabling small farmers to have direct access to markets, mga ganon. But the important thing is that you identify nga the objects of your study. And then another way of limiting the object of your study or limiting the scope of your study is clearly explaining what is your methodology. So, for example, here, the methodology refers to methodology can be broken down into method and logos or reasoning for. So, what is your method of doing research and what is your reason for adopting that particular method? So, the word methodology seems to be, quite intimidating and daunting. Like you're explaining what? Basically, you're explaining how you chose to conduct the research. What were the methods that you used? For example, did you do bibliographical or library work? Did you do qualitative interviews? Did you do quantitative surveys? Did you do archival research or whatever? You're just gonna what you're gonna do in the methodology section is simply to explain how you went about looking for the answers to your research question and why did you choose to adopt those particular methods in answering your question. That's basically what methodology is. So in this example, I provided comparative analysis as a methodology. That's very, very general. um, so if I were actually writing a paper about this, I will identify what were the specific things that I chose to compare. So for example, things that might be used to compare these things or these objects of study. One, business model. So I would have to describe the business model of each service and then point out the similarities and differences in their business model or money making or profit making model. Then I would also look at their supply chains, like where do they get their produce, how do they secure supply, how do they distribute supply, how do they gauge demand, mga ganon. So comparative analysis here is very general and vague, but when you're actually writing the paper, you have to specify what were the things that you looked for and compared, and why did you compare these things? Like, what is the significance? So if you notice here, in my discussion of this part, yung limiting your study, for every choice that you make in your analytical or your inquiry paper or your paper, for every choice that you make when it comes to geographical scope, temporal scope, objects of study, and methodology, you always have to consider at the back of your mind why you're making these particular research choices. And then when you write the paper, you'll have to articulate your justification for your choices. So basically, bakit ito yung ginawa mo? Pwede namang ibang paraan yung gawin mo, pero bakit ito yung pinili mong paraan? So that's what you'll have to explain in your research paper. So as I wrote here in this presentation, some further questions that you can consider: why is Metro Manila the site of the study? Why during the pandemic? Why only 3 services? What are the principles of inclusion and exclusion for choosing the objects of study? Or why did you choose these particular services and not other forms of services? What are the elements of comparison? Why did you choose these particular elements? Why study the business model and supply chain of distribution services rather than, say, the consumption habits of end consumers? If your concern is about food access, sustainability, and security, why are you looking at the supply side and not on the consumption side, the demand side of the end consumers? Most importantly, what is the research question? What are the findings? How do all of these things relate to the broader issue of food security, access, and sustainability? So these are the sort of questions that you have to ask yourself when you're writing the paper. So if you're faced with writer's block when you're writing, one good thing to do is to simply list down your questions and then maybe open your your recording app on your phone, and then read the questions out loud to yourself and just, talk about your answers to the questions. Parang magmumuni-muni ka out loud, and then you have your phone app recording your answers. And then when you listen to your recording again, you might hit upon something that you can actually write down in your paper. So this works for me when I'm experiencing writer's block. Nakaharap ko yung word screen and I don't really know what to write. Um, just begin with your questions. Begin with your questions and then start recording your answers as if you're just talking to yourself, or as if you're just talking to a friend or your pet or whatever. Just record mo lang siya. And then when you listen to it again, you might find some clarity about what your paper is actually about. So that when you sit down to write, you have a better idea of what the flow of your paper is gonna be like. Tapos when you're recording yourself on your voice recorder or something, there's less pressure, di ba, for things to be perfect than when you're actually typing on Word. Kasi when you're already typing things down, parang ang final na niya, tapos parang ang sakit mag-delete ng mga sentences and paragraphs when you figure out na, oh no, I'm racing against the clock and I'm trying to fulfill a word count. When you're just talking to yourself, you just go on and on, like what I'm doing right now. And then afterwards, when you listen to it, you just pick out the parts that are important or that make sense. Okay, so the next part is skimming. And this part E, skimming, is related to part B, the five-step method for reading actively in a strategically non-linear fashion. So when you're skimming a text, you can do this once you have a general idea of what the entire text is about and what the general flow of the argument is. Then you can decide which parts to read closely and carefully and which parts you can skim. But skimming itself is also a skill that you can develop. Speed reading or skimming is also a skill that you can develop. So Zachary Shore has these recommendations for speed reading. First, whenever you read through a page, and you have, di ba, in every page you see the text organized according to paragraphs. As you know, a paragraph is organized around a central idea or the topic sentence, usually expressed in the topic sentence. So whenever you come upon a new paragraph, the quickest way to figure out what that entire paragraph is about is to locate the topic sentence. Usually, the topic sentence is near the top of the paragraph, or if it's not there, it's near the bottom of the paragraph. Very rarely do you find it in the middle of the paragraph. So once you have the topic sentence of that paragraph, then you have a general idea of what the entire paragraph is going to be about. Because the rest of the sentences in that paragraph would just be elaborating or explaining the main idea as articulated in the topic sentence. So if you want to read actively while skimming, you can also restate and write down the topic sentence or the main idea of that paragraph in your own words. And after doing that, you can decide whether to read the entire paragraph. Let's say the topic sentence indicates that it is an important paragraph for your own inquiry, then you can read the entire paragraph, or you can just choose to skip it. Pero list down the topic sentence then in your own words so that when you go back to your notes, di ba, you have a map of the entire essay. So when you're called for recitation, you have a very good outline of the entire text. Kasi for every paragraph that you chose to skim, you were able to distill or state the main idea for yourself. So yan, magandang tip yan for studying, for exams and stuff. Even when you're skimming things, at least write down the general idea of each paragraph that you're skipping. Yun, so that's a skill in skimming. I think that's a really helpful suggestion. And then lastly, for this section, if you're having trouble understanding a long and complicated sentence and academic writing is often very full of long and complicated sentences. Break it down into its constituent ideas or the main ideas that make up this very long sentence. Always have a dictionary at hand if you need to, and I would say that you always need to have a dictionary at hand kasi um, that's also something that I practice na when I read and when I'm unsure about a word, I always have to look it up. Kasi it's more embarrassing if you end up assuming that a certain word means a certain thing, tapos mali ka pala, tapos pag-recite mo, mali yung sinabi mo. And that's kind of embarrassing. So I would rather know exactly what a word means so that I do not misunderstand things. Also, studies have shown that our initial understanding of something tends to stick even when we are presented with contrary evidence. So it's when once an idea lodges itself in our brains, it's a lot more difficult to correct it later on. So I would rather formulate a correct understanding of something the first time because if not, I might forget that my initial understanding was misguided pala. So just have a dictionary at hand whenever you're reading something. Okay, so moving on to part two, how to read part two, critiquing a text. So what is a critique? Shore defines a critique as an analysis of the author's arguments, a test of the soundness of the author's claims. Generally, criticism consists in questioning either the author's empirical evidence or her leaps of logic. So recall that in the previous section, we discussed how academic argumentation is usually made up of two main parts. The first one are your empirics or your, concrete pieces of evidence used to justify your position. And the second is the reasoning or the logic of your argument. So when you criticize an argument or when you criticize a piece of writing, you can either interrogate the empirical evidence, like you can ask questions like, is this evidence relevant to the claim? Is this evidence verifiable? Did it come from credible sources of information or baka fake news lang siya? So when you're criticizing an argument, you can either attack or interrogate the author's empirics, or you can attack their logics, leaps in logic or reasoning. So kunwari, may present na data yung author and then they interpret the data in a particular way, you can challenge the author's interpretation of the data and say, hey, this is your argument about the data, but if you look at it from a different point of view, let's say you are interpreting the data from the perspective of middle class consumers. But if you look at the data from the perspective of the farmers who are selling their produce at very, very low rates, na lugi na sila, the interpretation of the data can be different. So again, you can either challenge the soundness of the empirics or the soundness of the logic. And usually, one way of challenging the soundness of somebody's logic is also exposing the position from which the interpretation is being made. Not usually, but sometimes you can do that. Like the author may be presenting their position as objective and neutral, but sometimes it's not actually objective and neutral. Na there are some assumptions that are not being laid out explicitly or are not being interrogated yung assumption. So you can also challenge the assumptions that underlie the reasoning of a particular author. So that is a critique. So critique is hindi lang reklamo or critique is hindi lang, I was bored or this was too long or I don't think this was relevant. Hindi pa rin ganun lang. Your criticism must always be justified with reference to the empirical or logical parts of the author's argument. Okay? So what is a critique not? A critique is not a mere summary or reiteration of what the author has said. Like you can do that as part of the critique. Na you're restating the author's arguments para lang klaro yung understanding mo of the author's arguments. So when you restate things in your own words, you are also presenting your understanding of the what is communicated by the author. So you can do that, yung restating or summarizing what the author has said as a first step to contextualizing your criticism. But you have to move beyond that. Now, you're not just restating, but you're also challenging certain aspects of the author's argument, or you may be shifting the emphasis on a part of the argument that you think is particularly important but is not given enough attention in the text. So pwedeng ganon. Now, you're not just restating, but you're also going beyond that by contributing to the understanding or the criticism of the text. A critique is also not a mere complaint. Again, whenever you do criticism, you have to be aware of the research problem. Na parang, okay, this is the research problem of the paper, and this is how the author answers the research problem. Was the author successful or not in achieving his purpose, his or her purpose? So yung critique, it's not just a complaint, but it's rooted or in or anchored on the purpose of the writing itself. You're assessing whether the author was successful or not in the project that they sought to embark on. Next, Zachary Short talks about cheap critiques. Cheap critiques is when, for example, some author gives a talk on feminism in China. Tapos in talking about feminism in China, the author focuses on the feminist organizing practices of migrant factory workers in Shenzhen or something. So let's say that is the scope of the author's study. Na she's talking about the working class migrant women factory workers in Shenzhen and then looks at their unionizing or labor organizing practices to talk about their feminism. So, pag yun yung scope ng author and the study of the author, if you say something like, why didn't you discuss the corporate female bosses working in Shanghai, mga ganyan. That would be an example of a cheap critique. A cheap critique is when you're just saying stuff like, why didn't you discuss this? Why didn't you discuss that? Without reference to the actual project that the author wanted to do. And this author wanted to investigate working class feminism and not upper class feminism of women in Shanghai. So you have to consider na maybe the author didn't talk about these women working in top corporate jobs in Shanghai because she wanted to focus on working class feminism of factory workers. So always remember, as Zachary Shore says, that a book or article is a bounded endeavor, meaning a research work is always limited by the kind of limits that we have discussed to temporality, geography, research objects, etc. So a book or article is a bounded endeavor. Every author must draw a limit somewhere because you cannot possibly study everything. You don't have 100 years to write a paper. So if you are going to critique an author for not having done something, that something that is supposedly missing from their work must be essential to our understanding of the subject or the topic of the study. So you won't be able to make that judgment call unless you have a clear idea of what the author was trying to do. So avoid cheap critiques by making sure that you know what it is that the author was trying to do. So there's some burden on you as the reader to really try to understand the project of an essay, but there's also burden on the author to clearly communicate what he or she is trying to do in the research and what sort of knowledge she is trying to contribute to existing knowledge about the subject. So, ganun yung obligation. Zachary Shore also presents some techniques for mapping or for criticizing a piece of work that you are asked to do a review of or that you are asked to criticize. So first, you map the arguments, meaning you identify the main elements of the argument, such as the thesis, the empirics, the logic, and then their relationship to one another. So these elements, again, the elements that you need to be mindful of, what is the research question or the research problem? What is the thesis or the main answer to that problem? What are the empirics that the author uses? Empirics meaning evidence. What is the reasoning or the logic used by the author? Does the conclusion fit the content of the study, or is the body of the paper sufficiently captured by the conclusion? So these are your elements that you can look at in mapping an argument. So main fronts of attack. Um, if you notice, no, Zachary Shore's approach to criticism is kind of combative, not combative, but the purpose is really to challenge ideas to see whether they will hold. So parang yung purpose of criticism here is not so much to help the reader, the writer improve their writing, but to like surface or to bring out the mistakes in the piece. Parang yun yung nagiging um, purpose of criticism here. So that's why the language here is in the book is framed in terms of attack, kind of combative. But in our own workshops for our class, for our own purposes, remember that when you do criticism for the workshop, your purpose is not so much to point out the mistakes of the author, but to help the author improve their writing. So of course, ano siya, no? Magka magkadikit yan na in order to improve the writing, you have to figure out what the mistakes are. So the things that we're discussing now are also relevant to that project. Now, in order to help the writer improve, you point out all of the mistakes and then give the author some suggestions for addressing those mistakes. But in formulating your suggestions and your arguments in criticism in the workshops particularly, remember that the ultimate goal is not to say that the writer is mali. That's not the point, no? That the writer is wrong. The main point is to help the writer improve their writing, to improve their analysis. So for writers, don't take it badly when your mistakes are pointed out because that is essential to improving your work. And it's better that your mistakes are pointed out at an early stage rather than having your mistakes pointed out when your work is already published. Mas nakakahiya yun, di ba? Na buong madla ang magsasabing mali ka. So it's better that your mistakes are pointed out at the developmental stage when you can still make changes to what you wrote rather than at the stage of publication. Maaakusahan ko pa ng fake news or something. So don't take it badly. Yun. Anyway, moving on, continuing in this. So one main front of attack is attacking or challenging the thesis or the main argument. You can ask questions like, are the premises of the empirics and the logic sound, meaning logically sound? Do they hold up to reason? Does the conclusion follow logically from the premises of the argument? Are the conclusions overstated or overgeneralized? Or in other words, is there enough evidence to support the claim, or is the claim too big for the kind of evidence presented to the reader? Other things or parts of the paper that you can look at, the methods. You can ask questions like, are the methods of investigation appropriate to the line of questioning being pursued? So for example, you want to deepen your understanding of why students have been dropping out of school during the pandemic. Pero ang ginagamit mo lang na resources for answering that question are multiple choice surveys that fail to capture like deeper reasons for dropping out. If you want to, for example, thicken or deepen your understanding of a particular social phenomenon, you might consider whether it's most helpful to use quantitative research methods like multiple choice, very structured surveys, or maybe it's better to use more qualitative methods like in-depth interviews. So in the method section of this part of the presentation, you can again ask, are the methods of investigation appropriate to the line of questioning? So this is also why when you write your paper, you could explain your methodology for the research project that you did. If this is your problem and this is your question and this is your argument, why did you adopt particular research methods for investigating this problem. You also have to explain that para you leave yourself defended, parang you defend yourself from challenges to your methodology. Other questions that you can ask: could a different method produce a different and equally plausible interpretation? Is the scope of the study too broad or too narrow for the question to be sufficiently answered? So these are questions relating to how you limit the scope of your study. And then another question are the standards of qualification, which define what is a sufficient answer, too high or too low. Parang, what are your conditions for saying that, let's say, the pandemic response of the government is effective? What are your standards for saying that it is effective? So you can also here question your standards of qualification for saying that something is effective or not, for saying that something is successful or not. So again, at every step, you present your reasons for the judgments that you make. You present your reasons, you present your evidence. Another thing that you can attack when you are reading somebody's writing is, and this is especially important in our information hypersaturated age, you ask, are the sources of information credible? Kasi again, in academic writing, the information and knowledge that you construct is only as credible as your sources of information. So you always have to ask, is the article being referenced by the author here worthy of being believed in? O baka fake news lang siya, or even if it's not fake news. Kasi some resources or some sources of information go very in-depth into a topic. They present you with comprehensive perspectives. They present you with really, carefully collected data. And some resources of information, some sources of information naman, are only very superficial in their treatment of the topic. So pwedeng they're not presenting fake news, but their treatment of the topic is very superficial and shallow. So let's say you're given a choice between an academic paper and some random, web article, you might prefer the academic article to the general web article. Kasi the audience of a general web article would be like a more general audience than the audience of an academic article, which is targeted towards members of the academic community. So their treatment of the subject would be like the academic article's treatment of its research topic would be more in-depth and comprehensive than a general web article for the general reader. Ganon. So when choosing your sources of information, you also want to go to the sources that go in depth in analyzing a topic rather than, doing a superficial analysis. Kasi if you only read superficial stuff, then your analysis would also be superficial. And you don't want that, diba? Kasi the goal of academic writing is to deepen, to develop your skills in thinking and analysis. And those things won't happen if you just keep reading the easy stuff that don't actually make you think about something. So challenge yourself then in the sort of sources that you pick for your research. Kasi that's also how you develop your own thinking. So don't be so scared of complexity. Don't be so scared of difficulty. If you just read the easy stuff, you won't develop your thinking. You will end up like having a superficial take on things if you read the superficial stuff. So as Shore writes here, scholarship should advance our understanding of people, processes, or periods. So ask if the text has achieved this end. If you begin with a challenging mindset, assuming that there are weaknesses to be found, you will probably be rigorous in your critique. If your goal again is to make an argument like really strong, it helps to adopt this kind of mindset. So when you're evaluating your sources, ask, are the sources new or old? If new, do they enhance our understanding of the problem, or do they merely corroborate what we already knew? If old, are they being viewed in a fresh light in a way that changes our current perspective on the problem, or are they not adding anything of value? So these are also questions that you can ask when you're using or referencing sources. So for module 3, and again, this module is titled Research as Organized Curiosity, Reading as Strategy. I just wanted to focus on these parts of the presentation: how to read, part 1, dissecting a text; how to read, part 2, critiquing a text; and yeah, that those parts. So I also included here how to write and how to research. Please read these parts of the presentation. I won't go in depth into them right now, but read them, and then if you have any questions about them, please raise your questions in the comment section of the relevant post. Let me just um, let me just skim through part 3, how to research, and go to the near the end of this section, how to research part 3 near the end. Here. Remember again that the research goal is to answer a meaningful question. A meaningful question is one that must lead to an answer that advances our knowledge of something that genuinely matters. Your question must fill a gap in the literature. Literature here means existing research on the subject. It must tell us something that we don't already know, as well as something that we actually need to know. So this is the purpose of research. In order to conduct good research, again, you need to find credible sources of information. So let me discuss the CRAP test here in the section Resources for Further Study. Let me discuss the CRAP test to evaluate and determine the credibility and reliability of a source. And this is particularly relevant for your exercise on creating the annotated bibliography. A bibliography is basically a list of the sources that you plan to read or use for your paper. So when choosing resources for study, you have to look at 5 main elements. First, you have to consider the currency of the source, meaning is it presenting information that is relevant to the contemporary issue that you are looking at, or is the source too old as to present no new information that is relevant to the contemporary situation? Remember that social problems are also historical. Now, if you look at the question of land reform in the 1920s, let's say, the situation of land reform in the 1920s would be different from the situation of land reform in, say, the 2020s, when a lot of previously agricultural land have already been converted into non-agricultural land, many of which have been turned into, concrete buildings, subdivisions, etc. A lot of the subdivisions used to be agricultural land that were converted by landowners to avoid getting them distributed through land reform. So the situation of land reform in the 1920s, before the law on land reform was passed, is different from the conditions for land reform now. So when you're looking at sources for study that you can use in your research, consider the historicity of the source, the historical context of the source. Kasi ayun nga, the source that you're referencing must be relevant to the contemporary iteration or situation of the problem that you are looking at or considering. You also have to consider the relevance of the source, whether it is directly related to the question that you are investigating. You also have to consider the authority of the source, meaning you can look at the publisher of the source. Like, is the publisher a trustworthy and established academic publisher, or is it some random internet website that has no clear credentials? You can also look at the author of the work. Is this author qualified to discuss the topics that he is discussing, or is he not? Does he not have the appropriate credentials to talk about what he's talking about. Now, let's say you find an article on COVID epidemiology, pero yung nagsulat pala ay lawyer. Do they have the appropriate qualifications for talking about a particular topic? Or nagbibigay ng commentary about the Ukraine crisis pero wala namang alam sa international relations? So you ask these things of your sources as well. Na, does this source have the authority to present information about this topic? So again, you can look at the credentials of the author. You can also look at the publisher, whether this publisher is an established and reputable publisher. You can also look at the accuracy of the information presented. Whenever the author cites statistics, for instance, does the author provide the source of statistics or the information? Or para bang inimbento lang niya out of thin air? When the author presents data, does the author support the data with numbers and, let's say, research, actual research that you can verify, or is the research supposedly presented just quoted from somewhere else with little attribution? So you also have to check the accuracy of the information provided, as well as the verifiability of the information provided. Then lastly, you have to ask, what is the purpose of the information or the writing? What is the intention of the author or the publisher? What is the political affiliation or bias of the author or the publisher? Is the point of view of the writing like clearly biased, and does it account for its own biases, or does it pretend to be completely objective or neutral while hiding biased or partisan affiliation? Political bias or a political ideology does not necessarily mean that the writing is bad or that the writing is not worthy of being believed in. It depends on how the author also accounts for their political ideology. Kasi often, a lot of the theoretical lens that we use to analyze particular issues are rooted in ideology. So for example, if you're campaigning for the RH law, or when you're campaigning for gender equity, or when you're campaigning for the legalization of divorce and same-sex marriage, often you would draw from feminist perspectives on gender equality. So hindi the analysis is not completely neutral or biased because you have this ideological commitment to promoting gender equality. Or if you're, let's say, proposing a wage hike for minimum wage earners across the board, or if you're writing a paper on ending contractualization, or if you're writing a paper on instituting progressive taxation such that the top 1% should be paying 50% income tax or something like that, often you would be drawing on socialist or Marxist perspectives on wealth redistribution. So often, analyses about social issues in particular are not completely neutral or objective. But as a writer, you have to clarify where you are coming from, what position you are taking, and whose interests you are concerned about, whether you're campaigning for the interests of gender or sexual minorities, or whether you're campaigning for the interests of the working class masses. Your biases have to be clear and articulated and accounted for in your writing. And justified. Now, I'm taking this particular position because so and so. So the problem arises when you're presenting a clearly biased opinion, but you're presenting it as absolute and completely value neutral, universal truth. Then that's a problem. So when you read something, try to identify the political bias of the piece that you are reading so that you can have like a better idea of how much fact checking, for example, you need to do in order to verify the information presented by the author, knowing that the author might be biased in this or that particular way. And that also comes to your own writing. Now, if you know that you have a tendency to be biased about particular things, then you also have to be extra careful that you are not simply reproducing your bias uncritically, but whenever you make an argument from your position, your argument is still backed up by facts, by truth, by verifiable information, so that you don't let your writing be entirely run by your subjective bias, but it has to be grounded on um, actual truth, actual facts. So awareness of the bias of something is also important. So you question the purpose for the existence of a particular kind of information. So here I included this very nifty, useful table for evaluating your sources of information. Please read through them. I won't read them out loud for you. And then I also included some questions that you can ask in order to evaluate information more clearly. So these are the things that you can ask. In this presentation, I also included some videos, mostly for citation purposes, how to cite journal articles using MLA, how to identify the parts of a journal article so that you can cite things properly, and how to distinguish between databases, which are basically academic platforms that store papers. So these include Elsevier, JSTOR, Project News, Sage Publications. These are your platforms for disseminating, collecting, archiving scholarly materials. And the scholarly journals, because sometimes this is a common mistake that I see in student citations. Now, they're citing an article from a journal. Let's say the journal is the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies. But instead of putting the journal title Southeast Asian Studies, they put something like JSTOR or SAGE. Um, so you have to distinguish the difference between the title of the journal and often the publisher of this journal. So let's say, for example, Humanities Diliman is published by the University of the Philippines Diliman. It's not published by JSTOR or Project News. Critica Cultura is published by the Ateneo de Manila University. It is not published by Elsevier, mga ganon, even if it is available on Elsevier, let's say. So when citing journal articles, please distinguish between the title of the journal itself, and please refer to the resource on identifying the parts of a journal citation to figure that out, and the platform or the database in which it is found. So examples of databases again are here: Springer, Taylor and Francis, Elsevier, Sage, Wiley, etc. Generally, a lot of the stuff that you need for your research, let's say those journals indexed by JSTOR or Sage or Wiley or Elsevier, generally, I think these are available through the UP Main Library website. But again, if you encounter a paywall, you can use Sci-Hub. Okay, so that's it for today. I have kept my discussion to less than an hour and 30 minutes. If you have questions about the other parts of this presentation, please feel free to ask them in the comments section, or you can ask them during Module 4 when we will discuss writing as inquiry and analysis. Thank you.